In the history of Western art, there are many great artists whose work we know well, but also many whose lives remain shrouded in uncertainty. One such artist was active in the Netherlands, but that is virtually all we know about him. We know nothing of where he was born, his background, or his earliest years. Not one letter or document by his own hand has survived. To tell his story, we must rely almost exclusively on his unique works of art. It's only through these paintings and drawings that we can appreciate the life of Pieter Bruegel. In the early 20th century, the advent of color printing enabled the paintings of Bruegel to command the attention of a huge new audience. As a result, his scenes of Flemish peasant life are now amongst the best-known images of 16th century art. But there is far more to the work of Pieter Bruegel than these genre scenes of everyday life. His artistic legacy is diverse and full of striking contrasts.
It's very difficult to think of Bruegel simply as a sort of Brouwer of his day, interested in peasants vomiting and dropping their trousers in the corner and so on. There is so much in his work that suggests a profound seriousness. I find myself standing in front of the Red Calvary in Vienna, absolutely torn by it. More so than in some great Italian Renaissance paintings or some great 17th century Spanish paintings, much more aware of the pain.
The people for whom these pictures were designed were classically educated, so they would have made reference in looking at Bruegel's images to classical writers on the countryside, for example, or Pliny the Elder's chapters on the history of art where Pieter Bruegel was compared to classical painters. They would have known and been interested in from a kind of nascently nationalistic perspective in the vernacular tradition of Netherlandish proverbs. And they would have come wanting to talk about these things and looking for that kind of textually based significance.
Bruegel was born in the Netherlands during the 1520s, but that is all we know for certain. His only biographer, Karel van Mander, claims that he trained with the well-known painter Pieter Kok, a resident of Antwerp. Although Bruegel and Kok were definitely acquainted, we cannot be sure of Bruegel's residency in Antwerp before 1551, when he became a member of the city's Guild of Painters. Shortly after his entry into the Artists' Guild, Bruegel headed south on an already well-trodden path for young artists. His destination, Italy. During his trip, Bruegel was captivated by the great peaks of the Alps. When he returned to Antwerp around 1554, he began to make landscape drawings in ink, inspired by his mountain experiences. Biographer Karel van Mander described Bruegel as having swallowed the mountains and cliffs, so that he could spit them out again afterwards in his studio.
There was always a landscape tradition in the Netherlands. You would have the backgrounds of paintings with very detailed landscape. But on the other hand, you could really imagine that somebody coming from the flat Netherlands with huge skies would really be overawed by these gigantic Alps. But also on a more prosaic note, it may very well have been Hieronymus Kok, the printmaker, who actually sent him and who saw the potential in landscape or drawings, and he could then make them into prints.
The real development in landscape, of course, took place on the homeward journey. And it is in a sense documented by that wonderful drawing in the collection of the Courtier Institute, which used to belong to Count Ceylon, in which we have an alpine landscape with an artist sitting with a pad on his knee, and a little hunched figure in the landscape, quite clearly drawing in the open air. Now, I do not believe that he was the first to sit down with a pad on his knee and draw in the open air, but he was certainly one of the greatest.
Bruegel's earliest surviving canvases reveal his love of mountain scenes. In Landscape with the Parable of the Sower, the cold, craggy peaks of the background contrast dramatically with the warm rusticity of the left foreground, where we see the sower described in Christ's parable. The diagonal of the river flowing into sunlit open sea makes this a satisfying and unified scene, with Jesus and his followers almost dismissively small in comparison to the grand sweep of nature. Perhaps Bruegel intended to convey a sense of the true proportion of man. This is also possible with The Flight of Icarus, a depiction of the legendary fate of Icarus, the young man who flew too close to the sun. But at first glance, the doomed youth can hardly be noticed. Again, the message here may be the limits of the significance of man. But Bruegel surely has another objective. The young man's final struggle for life is almost comic, a device which highlights the folly of his actions, and more broadly, the folly of man as a whole. This was a subject which Bruegel had already addressed. Around 1558, by the time this canvas was painted, Bruegel had become established in Antwerp, and his drawings were published regularly by a fellow citizen and friend, Hieronymus Koch. One of these published drawings was Big Fish Eating the Little Fish, a clearly satirical comment on human folly, inspired by a contemporary proverb. But when this first image was published, it was not presented to the public as Bruegel's work. Instead, his publisher marketed the print as the creation of an earlier Dutch master, an artist whose influence was at its peak in the Netherlands of the mid-16th century, and whose example would repeatedly inform the work of Pieter Bruegel. His name was Hieronymus Bosch.
Hieronymus Koch asked Bruegel to do designs in the style of Bosch. So he did large fish eating the small, and the 7 deadly sins. And he was really called the second Bosch at the time.
The influence of Bosch on Bruegel's drawings was both stylistic and thematic. Bosch's work typically imparted a satirical message through crowded, detailed images which exposed the foolishness of his fellow men. Published Bruegel drawings followed his example, in images such as The Ass in the School and The Alchemist, which depicts a father and husband oblivious to the hunger of his family as he pursues his futile pseudoscience. By now, drawings such as this had gained Bruegel the nickname of the second Bosch. This view of Bruegel can only have been enhanced by a series of panels created by him at the end of the 1550s. 3 works mark the beginning of his greatness as a painter. With children's games, we again see the influences of Bosch in composition and theme. At first glance, this is just a crowded image of children playing games in a city square. But there's a curious joylessness about this apparently carefree scene. Bruegel is using the children's game symbolically. We can see them as representative of all those adult activities which seem so important and time-consuming to those engaged in them, but which are ultimately devoid of value or meaning. It is a symbolism that has lost none of its power over 450 years. This panel from 1559 also conveys a sense of dysfunctional human activity. This is Netherlands Proverbs, a visual depiction of over 100 popular contemporary sayings. Proverbs were especially popular at the time, and the great Dutch humanist Erasmus had published a book listing over 800 of them, many of which are now impossibly obscure in meaning. The same is true of many of the sayings depicted by Bruegel. Few modern viewers can be previously aware that the act of fixing a beard to Christ's chin indicates a lack of monastic faith, or that the blue cloak being fitted to this man reveals the unfaithfulness of his wife. Some prior knowledge is also needed to fully appreciate the many subtleties of Carnival versus Lent, also from 1559, though the immediate message is clear enough. The left of the panel depicts the indulgent spirit of Carnival, the immediate pleasures of the body and the senses. Against this, on the right, the spirit of Lent, the virtues of abstinence and the permanence of the spirit. Bruegel personifies these opposing spirits at the front center of the panel, presenting Carnival and Lent giving battle with each other. As we might expect, Carnival is a ludicrous, bloated figure brandishing a huge spit as he sits on an enormous barrel. But this is no simple condemnation of indulgence. Lent is hardly an attractive image either, and her followers fail to make a persuasive case for sobriety and abstinence. There is a sense of balance between the two sides, a recognition that in any disagreement, folly is never the exclusive preserve of one side alone. Another message that remains relevant today. In 1563, Antwerp was the finest artistic center of the Netherlands, and Bruegel was one of its high achievers. But 1563 was a year of change for Bruegel. In the spring, he was married to Maken Kok, daughter of Pieter, the man who was almost certainly his old tutor. Bruegel's biographer Karel van Mander describes how the marriage was forced upon the artist by his mother, who was apparently keen to end his existing relationship with a servant girl. Following his marriage to Maken Kok, Bruegel left Antwerp for Brussels, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Bruegel's art was also undergoing a process of change around this time. 3 panels survive from 1562 which reveal a conscious new approach to technique and subject matter. Many of Bruegel's paintings and drawings had already included disturbing details of torment and suffering in the manner of Bosch. Now, these elements became dominant. The Triumph of Death is a panel that lives up to his title. Here we can see a rampaging army of the dead, against which all living beings are doomed. On the desolate hills, the executioners are busy with their work, while the far background is a fiery scene of hell, reminiscent of the most nightmarish visions of Bosch. We can also see Bosch's influence in Mad Meg, another 1562 panel which shows a terrifying old hag derived from Dutch folk tradition. The fires and monsters indicate that this is a scene of hell itself, in which the dreadful central character is actually in the process of plundering. She cannot be resisted even by Satan himself, here represented in the form of a bizarre and indeterminate fish-like being. This is, perhaps, Bruegel's most Boschian image, along with Fall of the Rebel Angels, also completed in 1562. Here, animal forms contribute to the overall sense of horror, as the legions of Lucifer meet a terrible fate at the hands of St. Michael's army. It remains one of Bruegel's most striking works, an image of distinctive color hues and balanced figure arrangement from the brush of an already great artist.
We think of Bruegel as a painter with a wonderful command of aerial perspective, which indeed he became. But the earlier pictures, like De la Grite and The Fall of the Rebel Angels, this sense of space is absent.
I think the most striking thing about these two pictures is the way in which your eye is encouraged to kind of explore or dart about the picture, and you don't immediately see what's going on. There is one dominant figure, Mad Meg, Dulgriet, in her picture, which is a kind of satire on women, as far as one can tell. And in The Fall of the Rebel Angels, there are two major figures, but they are, in a sense, large-scale focuses within a kind of chaos, really.
It is a feature of Bruegel's career that his work can be divided into groups of images with a similarity of theme, attitude, and execution. Here we see Christ carrying the cross, a grim biblical event also depicted by Bosch earlier in the century. But at first glance, the Christian significance of the panel may not be obvious. The figure of Christ is insignificantly small in comparison with the grand sweep of the landscape and the swarming of the crowds. Perhaps it is these individuals who are the real subject matter here, especially as they are dressed in the clothing of Bruegel's own time and set against an undoubtedly contemporary landscape. This was a feature of Bruegel's religious work, as can be seen in The Census at Bethlehem, painted in 1566. If we were unfamiliar with the story of the Nativity, we might consider this to simply be a depiction of a chilly winter's day in an ordinary Dutch town of the 16th century.
The Census at Bethlehem, like many other paintings by Bruegel, takes place in a Bethlehem which is a village of his own day, using peasants of his own day in the costume of the day. So, this is not an aberration. This is the custom of the time. It would have been an enormous break from tradition if he had done the census in any other way, if he'd tried to imagine what Arab or Jewish costumes looked like 1,500 years before. And he would have failed.
This was not the only snowy image created by Bruegel. But with this panel, Hunters in the Snow, there is no need to search for any biblical message. Collectively entitled The Months, Bruegel created a series of panels depicting the various activities and the different environments of the passing seasons. With this calendar of scenes, Bruegel followed in a well-established tradition of Northern European art and made his own memorable contribution to it.
We don't actually know whether there were intended to be or indeed were 12 of those paintings, or whether there were six each representing 2 months.
The tradition of the months goes back to calendar illustrations in books of hours, and probably the more precise predecessors to Bruegel would have been manuscripts made in Bruges and Ghent at the beginning of the 16th century. But the big difference is that there you would have had the figures quite large and dominant, whereas with Bruegel you get this wonderful landscape, the figures integrated into the landscape, and the atmospheric conditions of the seasons being depicted and the whole atmosphere.
Only 5 of Bruegel's months paintings survive today, but they contribute greatly to his reputation as a master of genre painting. The months panels provide an enduring visual record of the tasks of the peasantry throughout the year. The gloomy day represents February, a time for pruning trees and gathering twigs. By contrast, August is a time for harvesting, and Bruegel's painting shows the rural workforce both working and resting after their arduous labor in the fields. When we come to examine the visual rendition of the previous month, showing the rural workforce busy making hay in July, we are left in no doubt that the labors of the peasantry are determined by nature. This impression, enhanced by the overwhelming landscape, characterizes the month series. But in artistic terms, the image of the hunters of January remains the most memorable of these genre scenes. Again, we do not need to look for messages below the surface of this wonderfully calm and unified painting. Instead, we can simply appreciate a scene of 16th century life set against a winter landscape, the work of an artist who was now a master of the technical difficulties of compositional layout.
If you want to take one single picture as an example of how threatening and mysterious and moody Bruegel could be with a painting, then The Hunters in the Snow is, I think, as good as any. It's essentially a black and white picture. It's austere, it's threatening, it's hostile. You feel the cold when you look at that picture. You feel that darkness is not far away. And although pleasurable, frivolous things are happening in the middle distance, there is something about the nature of the hunters which has a much larger significance than simply a man out to trap or catch or shoot something. That is there, that's on the surface, but underneath it there is a kind of subtlety which is very telling, perhaps even more telling because it uses the everyday in order to imply the real meaning.
By the time Bruegel painted this timeless image, he had reached the peak of his powers and was well on the way to establishing himself as the definitive painter of Dutch peasant life. Even now, he is sometimes referred to as Peasant Bruegel. And there is no doubt that Bruegel's most famous paintings are of peasant recreation scenes. The Peasant Dance is one of these remarkable works, a depiction of the common people engaged in feasting and drinking. The artist's established preoccupation with the folly of man may very well have inspired his choice of subject matter. But once again, it may be inappropriate to search too hard for hidden meanings behind the image. Perhaps we should simply admire Bruegel's mastery of depicting the solidity of the human form, and, more importantly, the sense of dynamism and movement that he now incorporated into his work.
Well, in the peasant dance in Vienna, the movement is created mainly through diagonals. You have the dancing couple in the foreground, rush into the painting from the side to join the others. And I suppose a lot of the other movement is created through different gestures in the painting.
In these late works, he integrates the monumental with, if you like, the crowd scene in a much more successful way than in something like Doelgriet, where you've got a sort of discrepancy of scale. And when you look at the peasant dance, through the placement of colour and through the rhythmic echoes across between figures and connections between figures, he actually makes you dance.
The same is true when considering the wedding banquet, probably the most famous image of Bruegel's entire career. This immaculately arranged panel presents us with a large group of peasants whose priorities for the day ahead are clearly drink, food, and music. In short, an isolated day of fun in a life whose hard labors we have already witnessed in other rural canvases. Bruegel was deeply suspicious of the self-consciously virtuous and understood the universal human need of occasional indulgences. This may explain why paintings like these remain so popular today.
They have their uses, these pictures, in that they record something which otherwise we might have lost. But as for being great paintings in themselves, I think that's pushing the argument for greatness a bit far.
By the year 1569, Bruegel had mastered his art. He was still in his 40s, and years of further achievement surely lay ahead for him. Now settled in Brussels with his wife, 2 sons, and a daughter, his work was much sought after by leading private patrons of his day. But tragically, it was not to be. On the 9th of September 1569, in Brussels, Bruegel died. Shortly afterwards, he was buried in the city's Church of Notre-Dame de la Chapelle. Typically, we have no idea what the cause of his death was. In the course of a relatively brief working life, Bruegel pursued a unique approach to his work, and the breadth of his achievement was remarkable. His art was still evolving in his final years, and we can only guess at what he might have created had his life not been cut short. But what he did achieve secures the status of Pieter Bruegel as one of the greatest of the Dutch masters.